the supreme leader of the Soviet Union, had a major stroke and was in and out of consciousness for several days. And every top Russian politician could not wait for him to die so that somebody could take his spot and the rest could move up the chain of command. But they couldn't show that. They didn't dare show that to anyone. In case Stalin got better and had them executed, they had to pretend to grieve. David has just heard that the Philistines have defeated the Israelite army and killed King Saul. And when he heard that, verse 11 and 12, he immediately mourned. Then he executed the man who claimed to have killed Saul. What next? Surely it's time for David to take the throne. This is what we've been waiting 16 chapters for. Saul has made David's life miserable for about 15 years, but that's all over now. Surviving in the wilderness, done. The king of the people's choosing is dead. The king after God's own heart can reign and rescue. And so we expect, verse 17, David to assemble the troops and let's go on the road to Hebron. Clear out Ziklag, grab your stuff, we're not coming back here. Hebron for the coronation. Instead, he writes a sad song. David laments with this lamentation, verse 17. He grieved with this song of grief. And then he insisted, verse 18, that Judah learns the song, and he makes sure that it's recorded in the book of Jasher, which we think is a lost Jewish history book. But we don't have to wonder what David wrote, because it's also here for us in 2 Samuel chapter 1. Now, when you first look at this, it's all a bit emo, isn't it? Why is he writing sad songs instead of taking the throne? But David's a man of action. And if he pauses to write a lament, he must have a good reason for it. There must be something for God's people to learn here. Now, before we get into the lessons of this passage, we need to make sure that we understand the song. And it's especially important that we do that with a song because songs are particularly easy to misunderstand. There's poetic words that don't always go in the normal order of English syntax. There's a well-known hymn that Fanny Crosby wrote, and it's got the line in it, "Gladly the cross I'll bear." And back in the UK, and back in time when hymns were still sung at primary school, one of the kids went up to one headmaster and said, "Excuse me, sir, who's gladly?" And he said, "What are you talking about? Who's gladly the cross-eyed bear that we keep singing about?" Then in other circumstances, there are archaic concepts in songs that we can sometimes miss. And so you had to learn when you were singing, "Come thou fount of every blessing," what an Ebenezer was. "Here I raise my Ebenezer." And you know, most of you, right, from 1 Samuel, it's the stone of memorial that says, "This far the Lord has brought us." But you had to learn that. And when you sang "A Debtor to Mercy Alone," you didn't know what it meant the first time you sang it, and neither did I when we were told, "I to the end shall endure as sure as the earnest is given." What's an earnest? I reckon there's a fair few of us who still don't know, even though we've sung that 10, 20 times. It's like a deposit on your wages, a bit of money that you got at the start of the day to guarantee you get some at the end of the day. But we don't use that word anymore, and so we can miss it. Songs are easy to misunderstand, so we need to take extra care. We're going to comb through this one and make sure that we know what's going on before we get into the practical application. Let's start with a revealing refrain. I'm going to read to you a little bit from Psalm 136, and then I've got a question for you. It's going to be one of the easiest questions you've ever been asked. Psalm 136, verse 1. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who alone does great wonders, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who by understanding made the heavens, for his steadfast love endures. What's the psalm about? That God's steadfast love endures forever. Easy question, because the refrain makes it really obvious. David's lament has a refrain. It's not as easy to see as the one in Psalm 136, but it's still there. It's in the middle of the first stanza, and then it has its own line in verse 25 and in verse 27. How the mighty have fallen. And in verse 27, David spells it out exactly what he's grieving. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished. Now, swords and daggers and axes can't perish. He's talking about the warriors of Israel and the champions, Jonathan and Saul and Saul's bodyguard. This is a song of heartbreak over the death of Israel's fighting men. Need that in mind. That's what this is about. Now, once we know that, we can jump into the first stanza, the first block, verse 19. And we see that this is a song, first of all, about total defeat. When David says, your glory, O Israel, he's not talking about God, because remember, this is a song about the defeat of Israel's fighting men. We know that from the refrain. The glory of Israel slain on the high places is the king, his sons, and his bodyguard. Now we know 31 of 1 Samuel 1 that Saul was king on Mount Gilboa. But David just calls it a high place here because he's drawing attention to the completeness of Israel's defeat. See, high places were defensible. That's a basic fact of anything military, right? High places are easier to defend. They're the strongest position to fight from. You don't need to have seen this third Star Wars movie to know if you've got the high ground, you're in a better position. Now, if somebody tells you that they were in a really bad flood, it was so bad it came all the way up to the ceiling, you don't say to them, oh, that sounds awful, but I'm glad your carpets were okay. If the flood came to the ceiling, you know the carpets are stuffed. When David says, your glory is slain on the high places, if the army's defeated at the high places, it's been defeated everywhere. So David's first lines are painting a picture for us of complete defeat. And then from total defeat, he twists the knife with total disgrace. Verse 20. David has no hope. He knows that he cannot stop the Philistines from rejoicing in their victory. And he knows that the Wyndhams of Philistia, the smallest towns, will hear the good news. We killed Israel's king and we routed their whole army. In these words, David's expressing shame for his people. He's saying this is embarrassing. Our king's head and his armor on tour around Philistia like the World Cup. This can't be. Don't let it be so. Don't report it in these places. Don't tell it in Gath. Don't publish it on the streets of Ashkelon. It's too bitter to bear. And then notice a subtle reference to faith. He calls the Philistine women the daughters of the uncircumcised. He's saying it's even worse than just our enemies, the people who have no covenant relationship with God. That the women who worship and burn their babies as sacrifices to idols, to have them believing that their rotten, made-up, vile gods have beaten the living God, this is a horrendously bitter pill to swallow. Verse 21 wraps up the sad scene with total disappointment, total defeat, total disgrace, total disappointment. See, Gilboa is the ideal place to make a last stand. But it had failed Saul. He put his confidence in the hill, and the hill hadn't protected him. So David curses it. He says, just as Saul's shield isn't washed and oiled after battle, made clean and made ready, so let Gilboa go dewless, rainless, dead, and dry. Just like Saul's shield stained, left, trampled, stained with blood and dirt, so Gilboa is stained with the memory of this defeat. Total defeat, disgrace, disappointment. But then there's a slight shift in the focus of the song. Luke Sheldrake recently had to abandon his car in those landslides that they had up north, and he didn't know if he was going to get it back or see it again. But the bigger disappointment for him wasn't losing the car, which I don't think he did in the end, but he was worried about losing his Bible, which was still inside it. And now the tone of David's song, which remains sad, shifts in focus away from the big picture to specific loss of Saul and Jonathan. And David begins, verse 22-24, with deep admiration. And this might surprise us, because after everything that Saul's done to David, he still hasn't lost his respect for Saul as king. And even now, he finds great things to say about him and Jonathan. He praises them as soldiers. Verse 22 could mean one of two things. It either means that Saul and Jonathan were not put off by the loss of their men or the might of their enemies, the blood of the slain or the fat of the mighty. Or it might mean that they killed many enemies, even the big scary ones. But either way, it's describing them as fearsome fighters. And then that's reinforced in verse 23 that they are swift as eagles and strong as lions. Then he praises them as family. Verse 23, they were loyal, which seems a bit rich, because Saul was only ever really loyal to himself and even accused Jonathan at one point of plotting against him. But Jonathan was unflinchingly loyal to Saul. He stuck with Saul even to death. And David generously credits Jonathan's loyalty to both of them. And then he praises Saul as king. Verse 24. Saul had showered gifts on Israel. And David insists that those who rejoiced, who were glad to benefit from Saul's life, must mourn his death. But then deep admiration is followed by deep loss. Verse 25-26. David says, the women of Israel should weep for Saul, but his biggest tears are for Jonathan. Because Saul gave the ladies gold, but Jonathan gave David love. And he says, better love than a woman. And that's nothing sexual. He's talking about the faithfulness of a wife. David's saying, Jonathan was more committed to me than a spouse. And that's not an exaggeration, because if you were to turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 23 and verse 17, we see Jonathan was willing to sacrifice his claim to be king in order to support David. He really loved David better than he loved himself. So that's the song. It's a song of grief, because Israel's soldiers and rulers have been killed. It's a song about total defeat and deep sorrow. And we've got our heads around it now. We understand it. What do we learn from this? 3 things. Number 1, it is right to grieve. David's grief wasn't like Stalin's generals. A fake grief that's really a varnish covering a hunger to jump into the dead man's shoes. His sorrow over Saul is real. And it's important that we know there is a place for real sadness in the lives of God's people. So the Bible commands us to rejoice in the Lord always. But that doesn't mean a Christian's life is all fluffy ducks. And Jesus also taught us, blessed are those who mourn. And he showed us by his example that a godly person, the godliest of men, experiences genuine grief. Being a Christian doesn't make anyone immune to sadness. And we don't need to be ashamed of our sorrow or letting other people see it. And we reject any prosperity preacher who says you've got sadness in your life because of a lack of faith. A couple of years ago, a couple asked to see me, and their daughter had just told them she was pregnant. And they were over the moon because they'd always wanted to be grandparents. But in the next breath, she said she wasn't keeping the baby. And she booked an abortion. And this couple were counting down the days on the calendar until their grandchild was murdered. Shouldn't they grieve? Isn't it right that God's people should weep in a situation like that? Or when your kids, as they grow up, turn their backs on the gospel and show no love for the Lord Jesus. Or your mum and dad tell you that they're getting a divorce. Or that preacher that you've loved and benefited from for years, he gets caught in a wicked scandal. When the doctor tells you that the tumor is inoperable, or the baby's growing in the wrong place, or not growing at all. What do you say to that person? Come on now. Cheer up. God's in control. David knew that. David knew that God's promises hadn't been shaken one bit by all that Saul had done. David knew one day it will be all right. But today he was bereft. So he wept. When things go badly for you, don't be ashamed to break your heart before God. He promises to be near the brokenhearted and to save those who are crushed in spirit. And so if we go on and say there's no space for grief in the Christian life, all we're doing is damming a channel of God's grace into your experience of life with Him. Lesson number 2. It's right for men to grieve. And I'm highlighting this because us blokes are much more prone to see mourning as weakness. But David lamented, and he's so macho, he makes us look like a bunch of defrosted prawns. The church needs men of action. Men who are prepared to stand up and be counted for our captain, Jesus. But is one reason that we're so reluctant to stand up for Jesus on issues, one reason why we find it so hard to stand up for issues is because we refuse to be wrecked by issues. This will make sense a little bit later. Let me just illustrate it for now. When we had Daniel, Sarah got really sick. She lost a lot of weight. She lost a lot of hair. And she was really unwell. And every day she battled really serious, quite terrible physical health, which had a big impact on her mental health. And I was semi-oblivious. And looking back on it now, it's obvious how sick she was. But at the time, and I could put it down to living with her and seeing her every day and maybe not noticing the decline being so gradual, but I don't think that's all it was. I think subconsciously I was shielding myself emotionally and not wanting to front up to what was going on, not wanting to really look. And I didn't realize how bad it was because I didn't want to think about it. And then one day, I don't know what it was, I don't know what made the difference, but I noticed how much she was struggling. And I began appreciating properly how bad it was. But it was only when I appreciated how bad it was that I did something about it. And we went to war together. And I started going to the doctor's appointments to advocate for her and say, no, that's not enough. You've got to do more. It was only then we went to war together for her to get better. Because men are fixers. If we see a problem, we want to do something about it. We want to act. But if we shield ourselves from grief, and if we refuse to be touched at the deep level, to mourn because it's not manly, if Satan convinces us that real men don't cry, he hamstrings us from action. We won't be moved to the sticking place where we actually do something about it. You see, mighty men of action are first godly men in grief. David's going to sort this mess out. He's going to grab this kingdom by the scruff of the neck. But before he does anything, he's going to lament. He will frame the problem properly in all of its grimness so that when it's time to attack the job, he attacks it with the seriousness and the focus that it needs. Don't be afraid of grief, men. It is God's tool to position us for effective service. Lesson 3. It's right for us to grieve in different ways. You know, David's song here is the second lamenting in the passage. And so in verse 11 to 12, there was immediate grief. And we could call that David's reaction, the immediate response. But then there's also, verse 19 to 27, intentional grief, which we could call David's rendition, where he turns his grief into a lasting lament that gets recorded and taught, shared with Judah. Now, we know that there's room for both in the lives of godly people because, again, the Lord Jesus did both. There was immediate grief when he stood outside Lazarus' tomb and wept. And there was intentional grief when he said to the crowds, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those that are sent to it, how often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers its brood under its wings, but you were not willing." That's heartache, thought out, eloquent heartache over what's happening with Jerusalem. Now, if we're walking in Jesus' footsteps, we shouldn't be surprised to see both of these things in the lives of his people. We need to see immediate Christian grief. I'm talking about strong, sorrowful responses to sin and suffering. And for David, that looked like wailing and tearing his robes and fasting from food. And for us, it might look like a whole variety of different things depending on the circumstances. I think of when Peregrine died and I drove up to Invercargill to see you guys and I had no idea what I was going to say all the way there in the car. Because what do you say? And there's just Romans 12:15 in my head. You weep with those who weep. And I don't remember what we said. I remember sitting in a lot of silence. Because that's what you do. You sit and you grieve together. Now, immediate grief should mainly show itself in earnest, heartfelt prayer. There's a place for silence in it, but prayer. And a will to drop everything and to seek God. And to plead with him on behalf of our brothers and our sisters who are suffering in war zones and under oppressive governments who have no love for God. When you see the memes and the news reports, it's to go to prayer, not to go to jokes, not to go to sharing it with a quippy, funny little remark, but to pray for Christ's kingdom to come and put an end to the Epstein. That's got to go. And the terrorists and the wickedness. I'm talking about real prayer that's born from a heart that doesn't protect itself from what it sees on the news or dismisses it or jokes about it, but from heaven's perspective looks at it and weeps and joins in with the martyr's prayer, holds onto the throne of God and says, how long, O Lord, before you come and do something about this? But then we also need to see intentional grief. And Dale Ralph Davis makes a really interesting application here. He says, recording this practice of thinking deeply about sorrow and writing it down, the fact that that's here for us in the scriptures, we're being invited to do the same thing. And he says, the sorrows and wounds God's people receive from their losses are not miraculously healed after a short time of emotional catharsis. In other words, we don't have a bit of a cry and pack a bit of a sad, and then that sorrow goes away. It's all over. It's not like that. He says sometimes in the church there is such an impatience with grief. Why isn't Alan? This is his words. Alan, I'm not picking on you. This is what Dale Ralph Davis writes in his book. And Linnea, don't worry about this person, Carol, that he mentions next. Why isn't Alan over Carol's death? It's been 18 months. Why can't that mum get over the death of a 10-year-old? It's been years. But the lament form of the Bible assumes our grief is deep and ongoing. And it invites us to enter the discipline of expressing that grief in words that convey our anguish, in images that picture despair, in written prayers that verbalize despondency. And then he says this, which I think is so helpful. Why should God's people be shoddy in their sorrow? Why wouldn't we take this seriously? He's arguing that we should not be shy about giving thoughtful voice to our grief. And he's thinking particularly when loved ones die, but applies more broadly to our suffering. The things that Christians face when something strikes your heart, or maybe when you read about something online, or you get an update from a missionary and you just say, I can't read anymore. What's going on with those kids? What's going on with those women? What's going on with those people? It's too sad to keep reading. Don't run from it. Write from it and take it to the Lord. Now, I was stumped by that application point because it's not something I've ever done before. And I brought it up at our Bible study on Wednesday night. And I said, what do you guys think of this? And all the women in the room said, that's just journaling. And maybe it is. And maybe some of the men need to do it as well. But there's a place for that. Writing down the grief that we experience and taking it to the Lord that way. Now, maybe the big question that all of us have got to ask, and I think particularly as somebody who's never done that before, has to ask is this: why? Right? What's the benefit? What's the point? What is the good that's going to be done by opening myself up to more grief? Two things from this passage. Number one, really quickly as we close. Number one, lament drives us to God. Now, David doesn't mention God in this song once. He's not there. It is a completely godless lament. Where is God in all this? That's exactly the question David wants you to ask. Why is Saul dead and Israel's army decimated? How did it go so wrong? Why are the bodies of our greatest warriors food for crows? Precisely because God wasn't there. Because Saul didn't want God, and so God let him fight alone. See, God isn't missing from this song because David forgot him. There are 60 psalms of lament. There's 150 psalms. 60 of them are laments. It's the biggest type of literature in the psalms, laments. So anybody saying, well, this isn't something for Christians, you got to change your mind. 60 psalms of lament. 35 of those, so over half, are attributed to David. We know David wrote them. There are a couple of others he might have written, but 35 definites. Of all those 35 laments that David wrote in the Psalms, God is the focus of the psalm. And in 33 of 35, God is mentioned in the first sentence. Do we really think that David wrote 36 laments, including this one, and just happened to forget God this time? No chance. Doesn't make sense. In fact, we know he hasn't forgotten God because look at the next verse, chapter 2, verse 1. After this, David inquired of the Lord. God's right at the forefront of his mind. You know, when Joe Biden became president and was inaugurated in 2021, Donald Trump refused to go. Broke tradition. You know, all those years of tradition, he's not going to be there. And his absence almost became a bigger deal than the inauguration itself. God isn't missing from the song because David forgot him. He's missing because David remembered that Israel forgot him. And when this song is taught to Israel, he wants the lasting lesson to be, this is what happens when God is absent. Taking time to grieve, to think deeply about our sadness, drives us to God. And a Christian never has to be afraid that their sadness will drive a wedge between them and Jesus. We can worry about that sometimes. Struggled with depression for years, and I worry about taking it to the Lord and talking about it with others, because I don't want it to drive a wedge between me and Him. I don't want it to be something that drives me away from Jesus. It doesn't work like that. Our present suffering drives the Christian deeper to Jesus because we know He's our only refuge and help in times of trouble. We've got nowhere else to go. And even when the reason for our trouble is that we've neglected God, that we've turned our back on His way and made choices against His will for us, when the suffering that we're grieving is self-inflicted, like Israel's suffering here, when we're in a ditch because we've run away from the Good Shepherd, not because we followed Him, well, even then, grieving draws us back to Him. Think of the lost son. He looks at the pig food in his hands and he thinks about what? Home. Dad. And his sadness at where he's at sends him back. And maybe you're not a Christian and you've been looking at your life recently and you're wondering, where is God? You know, if He's really there, why has my life worked out like this? Where is God? What a great question for you to ask. But ask a couple of other questions first. Have you wanted Him? Have you been living for Him and obeying His word? Have you been putting Him first, or have you been living your own way? If so, you can't be surprised when everything's a mess. But even now you can go to Him. And just as that father ran out to embrace the lost son, He would run out to meet you and wrap you up in His arms. And then secondly, and really, really quickly, lament fits us for war. Verse 17 has a footnote. It tells us that this song is called The Bow. And it's taught to the sons of Judah. The ESV says the people of Judah because it knows that the word it's translating there can be inclusive of all people. But when we look at the context and who's David speaking to, and the normal translation of it would be the sons, the men of Judah, and particularly David's men that he's surrounded with, which we know are all fighting men. This is a song for soldiers. Just like the Scots Guard playing their pipes as they go into battle, or the American paratroopers singing there's blood on the risers as they train. This is a marching song for Israel going to war. We say, how can it be? Because this is a song of total defeat. Total disgrace, total disappointment. That's not going to motivate them. You know, at the Battle of the Alamo, small group of Texans, totally outnumbered and wiped out by an overwhelming Mexican army. But they refused to surrender, and so they were killed. Even though the odds were way against them, they refused to surrender, and they were killed. 1 month later, the Texans won a decisive victory at San Jacinto that won them independence from Mexico and their freedom. And their battle cry as they went against the Mexicans was, "Remember the Alamo." It's a total defeat, a tragedy. But remembering those guys who gave their lives inspired them to new levels of bravery. If we never think about the sadness of circumstances in our world and the things that our Christian brothers and sisters suffer, they will not disturb our peace. And we won't do a thing to change them. If when you think about abortion and child abuse and cults or whatever other evil is going on, and it sets your teeth on edge, and so you swat it away like an annoying fly, and you say to yourself, I don't want to think about that. I don't want that sadness in my life. You do that, it will not do you the good that God can do through it. You'll be like a kid who won't take the medicine because it tastes bad, but then it can't heal. So next time you're moved by a missionary's letter, or what a Christian somewhere is enduring for Jesus, what a brother or sister is suffering, what atrocities are happening in our cities, and our hospitals, and our homes, have the bravery to stew in it, to marinate in it for a little while, and let it move you, and let it motivate you to pray and to preach the good news of Jesus, who is making all things new. Let's pray. Father in heaven, I find it so tempting to resist thinking about things that are grievous and sad. And I know I can be a coward in that regard. I want to be comfortable. I want life to be easy. I want to just focus on getting stuff and doing what everybody else does. I don't want to live that way because I want my life to count for you. And I want eternity to show that my eyes were firmly fixed not on this life, which is over so quickly, but the life to come with my King, at whose right hand are pleasures forevermore, and with whom even the cup of cold water given in his name won't lack its reward. Father, I pray that you would help us to work out exactly what you'd have us do in light of this passage. I pray, Holy Spirit, that you would make up for all the weaknesses of the preacher and drive home into the hearts of your people exactly how you would have each of us respond to this text. I pray that we'd be shaped by it and changed by it, that it wouldn't just be forgotten as a weird passage in the Old Testament, but something helpful, instructive, challenging, rebuking, and blessing as we